Welcome to Really This Week in History. I'm your host, Daniel Price. For anyone who has ever thought, man, we are living through history, this podcast is designed to prove you right. Weekly, a guest and I will discuss a current event, its historical context, and how it may be viewed by future historians. Today, I am fortunate enough to have Jim Bell, author, astronomer, and planetary scientist at the School of Earth and Space Exploration at Arizona State University. Jim, who published Hubble Legacy, 30 Years of Images and Discoveries last year, is a Carl Sagan Medal recipient and former president of the Planetary Society. We will be discussing Axiom Space's announcement of its first entirely private crew, a group that will be conducting a manned mission to the International Space Station in January of 2022. That crew consists of Larry Connor, a real estate and tech entrepreneur, Canadian financier Mark Matthey, and businessman Eitan Stibbe. Along with mission commander and veteran NASA astronaut Michael Lopez Alegria, each of these men paid a whopping $55 million for the upcoming trip. What steps along the way made this possible? Where do we go from here? And what will this event mean to future historians? Let's see what Jim had to say. All right, so Jim, welcome to the show. Appreciate you coming.
Great to be here, Daniel. Thank you.
Yep. So you are a author, astronomer, planetary scientist. Just last year, you wrote Hubble Legacy. Obviously, it was the 30-year transition of the Hubble Space Telescope. Besides the anniversary, what was it that led you to put that book out?
Well, I have been a scientific user of the Hubble Space Telescope going back to the very beginning when it was launched, working on the part of the mission that looks at solar system objects and Mars and other asteroids and other objects. So I've been a big fan of Hubble since the beginning. It's a great story. You know, it's a phoenix rising from the ashes story of a major engineering screw up, designing the mirror incorrectly and then getting up there, being out of focus, and a Herculean effort by engineers and astronauts to come up with a redesign and fly another shuttle mission to fix it, and then produces spectacular images, and then shuttle astronauts repairing it multiple times, risking their lives on these missions and spacewalks to keep that telescope working great and producing just spectacular images and other results about our solar system, our galaxy, and the entire universe. So I'm a big fan of Hubble, and so it was fun to celebrate 30 years of that mission.
That is awesome. Hubble is one of, obviously, the great accomplishments in space exploration. All of, or almost all of now, the great accomplishments in space exploration have been government-backed, government-funded. We are seeing now a private company, Axiom Space, working with a SpaceX rocket, sending mostly what are just private citizens up to the International Space Station. In the Cold War era, it was a battle between world superpowers, the dominance of space. And now we are at a point where it's basically what seems to me a bidding war among millionaires and billionaires to see the curve of the Earth. How did we transition from such a massive undertaking done by the world against and with itself to where we are today?
Yeah, no, it's a great question. I think it's actually, as weird as it might sound, totally natural. If you go back and look at the history of the airline industry, right, and that really got started around the turn of the 20th century, and really in the 1920s started to take off, pun intended. And at the time, as it was starting, it was rich flyboys and flygirls, aviators, pilots, professional pilots, super rich people who could afford this incredible thrill of this new technology of flying through the air, getting from point A to point B. And if you go back before that, there was the first railroads and the first telephones, and and I think throughout history there's been this vanguard of explorers, leaders, entrepreneurs, kings and queens. If you go back far enough, rich people who have been able to sort of drive technology forward. And so I think we're seeing the same thing in space. These aren't the first space tourists, in quotes, to go up into space. There have been millionaires and billionaires who've gone up on Russian rockets to their space station and to the International Space Station, and onesies, twosies. And now these crews are starting to get a little larger. The rockets are getting more reliable, and more of them, with companies like SpaceX, Blue Origin, and others, doing all these incredible innovations and lowering the cost of getting into space. So I think we're seeing, the sort of tip of the spear in the last decade of what is going to be a trend of making space more accessible to not just rich people, but middle class and everybody else, just like happened in the airline industry.
Right. I've seen Apollo 13, the movie, so many times. It's my stepdad's favorite movie, I do believe. And Tom Hanks, or Jim Lovell, I believe.
Yep.
Probably. Has a quote in the movie that says, there's nothing routine about going to the moon. Like you were discussing, air travel, cars, telephone, there was nothing routine about any of that in its early days. And now air travel, safest way to fly. You mentioned, or safest way to travel. You mentioned when you were discussing, the early days of Hubble, the astronauts going up risking their lives to do these things. Obviously, it is a big risk. These four men, and I think one other person at least that's going to be going up as a employee of Axiom, former NASA astronaut.
Right.
They are risking their lives here.
Yep.
Is this something that? When does it become routine, or as routine as space as air travel, for instance?
Yeah, it's a great question. I don't know the answer. Nobody knows the answer. When did that happen with cars? When did that happen with airplanes? At some point, you reach a critical mass of numbers of people using a certain technology that it becomes, in quotes, routine. Anyone who's taken an airplane flight, what's happening around you is spectacular. It's amazing. And, we sit there and sip your orange juice and eat your peanuts. And really, most people probably don't even really think about that. When you get in your car, what's happening is amazing and incredible. And if you try to describe it to somebody 100 years ago, they'd think you were, from another planet. And so, when is that going to happen with space travel? Probably, no, not next year or the next few years, but 100 years from now, I think we'll be there, right? So when do we cross that line? I don't know, but certainly there's lots of people, companies, engineers, even the government, U.S. government, NASA, working to try to get us over that line, to make access to space more affordable, safer, more part of our general economy and part of our general everyday lives.
And you mentioned, the steps necessary. What are the necessary steps to get there? Is it mostly private sector, the commercialization and profiteering off of this? Is it government? Is it a combination thereof?
Yeah, no, that's another great question. And, the model is, the airline industry is a great model for this. The government provides lots of initial seed funding and takes on the risk of the fact that this is new technology, that these are risky endeavors, that there might be failures as engines and systems and materials get stressed in ways that they haven't been stressed before, and research needs to be done to solve problems. And, the early days of the airline industry, there were private companies involved, but it was the government that poured enormous amounts of funding into it by asking those early startup companies to deliver the mail in the 1920s. Those early startup companies with names like United and Northwest, and some of whom are still around today, right? And it was the government that spurred that on. And then as risks go down, as safety goes up, as reliability goes up, as the public begins to trust more, as regulations go into effect, as the infrastructure was developed for airports and the FAA and air traffic control, all that infrastructure had to be put up by the government as well. All of us, taxpayers, invested in that. And then the government sort of hands it over, and it becomes a major industry and a gigantic job creator and a huge part of the global economic base. And it took, many, many decades for that to happen. We're seeing the same thing happen in space, right? I mean, SpaceX, we've heard a lot about SpaceX, and there's a perception that it's Elon Musk out there spending a bunch of his own money. Actually, SpaceX taps into NASA funding, government funding. Our tax dollars at work is helping to fund what SpaceX does. They compete. They write, proposals to, we're going to fly NASA astronauts to the space station. We're going to launch satellites for NASA and other government agencies. And NASA pays for that. And that's not really new. I mean, NASA didn't build the landers to send the Apollo astronauts to the moon. Those were built by private companies, Northrop Grumman and others. NASA contracted to private companies to build them. And so this isn't new for the government. But what we're seeing is there's a lot more entrepreneurial, so-called new space folks coming into it with lots of innovations, like re-landing the first stage of your rocket and then reusing it multiple times, thus lowering the cost dramatically to get to orbit. I mean, that's an innovation that is a super risky thing to try. And of course, these things blew up a bunch of times when they tried initially.
Right.
But the government is kind of backing that risk, helping these companies take those chances that the government itself isn't willing to take or can't take, doesn't have the staff, the manpower, the innovative individuals, et cetera, but willing to help that sector grow. And that's what's happening right now. And so, it took many decades for the airline industry. It took many decades for the railroads, the national power grid, many decades. It's going to take many decades for this to happen in space. But I predict that, by the end of the century, I predict we'll be at that routine point where we are with air travel.
I will only be reaching my centennial birthday in 2086. So maybe I will.
Right.
Maybe I will see it. My family tends to live forever.
Stay healthy, eat well, exercise. Yes, exactly.
Yeah. You mentioned the government footing the cost of this. That was a question I wanted to ask you. Obviously, going to the International Space Station costs more than $220 million. It sounds silly for me to say, that much money probably doesn't do that. But what if this is outside of your area of expertise, and I apologize, but what portion of the overall, enormous cost are these guests for next year to the International Space Station actually putting?
Well, they're just paying for the ride, and the infrastructure that's up there, the space station itself, hundreds of billions of dollars of U.S. taxpayer investment over the past several decades. It's taken, going back to the Reagan administration to build
right.
that incredible engineering structure. And it's taken international cooperation. It's not been NASA alone. The Europeans have been involved. The Russians have been involved, the Japanese have been involved, other countries all making contributions to that effort as well. And so that infrastructure is enormous and costly over many decades, as well as the infrastructure to launch the rockets, the whole Kennedy Space Center, the infrastructure to the manufacturing base needed to build some of these high-tech components. It's not all done in-house at these companies. They contract out to many others, and that's just part of the manufacturing base, high-tech manufacturing base in our country and others. All of that has some value. So, the ride to get there is a tiny fraction of what it has cost to make this even possible, and most of that money has been funded by the taxpayers.
Well invested, I would say.
I agree. We're not unbiased, but I agree.
So these four men, Larry Connor, Michael Lopez Alegria, Mark Pathy, Eitan Stibbe, they will be the first private crew on a private flight into space. They're not Neil Armstrong, they're not John Glenn, but what are they in the future's history of space travel? Are they Lewis and Clark, or are they a footnote in that chapter?
Yeah, that's a great question. I mean, remains to be seen, of course. And Michael L.A. is a professional astronaut. He's commanded missions in the past. He's been to the space station. So they're going. The other guys are going with an expert who's been this way before, but now he's going as a private citizen as opposed to a NASA astronaut. But I think this is part of a trend. We're going to see more and more of this. We're going to see eventually private crews, not just going to the space station, but going to the moon. Astronauts will be going back to the moon this decade from NASA in collaboration with Europeans and Canadians, Russians. The Chinese are talking about independently sending their astronauts to the moon. So, that's all coming up. And this sort of private, either thrill-seeking, which a lot of these guys are doing, and what a thrill it's going to be for them.
Absolutely.
Thrill seekers slash tourists that's going to increase. Or NASA, I can easily imagine, will eventually be sort of contracting out activities on the moon and in space. Hey, we need these particular satellites resurfaced. It's going to take an astronaut to go do it and replace these parts. And there'll be companies that will offer that service to NASA and other space agencies for a price much less than what the government could do it for on its own. Extracting resources on the moon to support a settlement, going and looking for some of that ice that's buried in those dark shadowed craters at the lunar poles, or processing some lunar soil to pull out oxygen or metals for construction on the moon. Those are things that on the Earth, there's a mining industry, there's a construction industry. There's no reason that those models can't work in space as well. The main reason is it's too expensive to get people there and too risky. But if you can lower the costs, which companies like SpaceX and Blue Origin and others are doing, and if you can increase the reliability and safety, which these companies are also doing with government support, then extending these sort of traditional terrestrial industries like construction, manufacturing, repair out into space makes perfect sense, and it just will become part of the world's economy.
Wonderful. Sounds like
I'm an optimist. You can tell I'm an optimist, right?
I love it. I like to try to be an optimist is where I think I've landed. I would love to be an optimist in most situations, and I do my best to be optimistic about the future of humankind, of mankind.
And look, this is all underpinned by your question about private activity in space. Is all underpinned by the fact that private companies need to make money, right? It's
Right.
the only entity that's going to go and explore space and do things without making money, losing all their money.
I thought we were being optimistic. Here, Jim.
Well, let's put some pragmatism into this as well. The only entity that knowingly loses money in space is our governments, right? We didn't make any money off of the Apollo astronauts. We don't make any money off of Mars rovers, right? It takes governments to do that. It's for the public good. It's to educate our kids. It's to learn about the universe around us, right? These are the profits that we get out of those investments. But companies need to make money. And right now, the customers that they are courting are the major space agencies, are the governments of the world. And so it'll make sense for government to pay for this service so this company can make some money, because it'll be done cheaper than if the government were to do it by themselves and reliably, which is sort of the nature of business everywhere, right?
So does government then end up being the entity that drives the cost down for everyone else to be able to make these, middle class missions to, low Earth orbit or the ISS or beyond?
Yeah, that's the model until these companies can figure out how to be sustainable. And maybe tourism is a way they could be sustainable. Just by providing these tourist experiences, they get the hotel companies get involved, the destination companies get involved, and tourism becomes a way to make money. It's a model that works on the Earth. It could work in space. It'll take a while to get there. Another model that could work is resource extraction, mining or whatever. Probably not to bring materials back to the Earth, because that's pretty expensive, but to live off the land out there on the moon, on asteroids, on Mars, and extract the materials locally that are needed to support exploration or settlement locally. There could be money in that. And there could actually be some money in mining for rare exotic minerals or chemical elements that are very hard to find and very expensive to extract on the Earth. Maybe some of these companies will find ways to do it inexpensively on the moon or from asteroids that pass close to the Earth, and there could be potentially money to be made on the Earth by bringing those materials back. I think that's probably the lowest odds of the latter scenario, but it's possible. So you have to kind of get creative and imagine what future business models might actually work that will compel companies to extend their presence out into space.
Awesome. Great answer. Obviously, this show is about, a current event and how it affects history. I would be remiss if we didn't bring up the anniversaries that we did just have recently, that we're about to have between the Apollo 1 fire, Challenger, Columbia. These are events that mark history, and they are the cost of, unfortunately, the cost of any exploration, whether it was, air travel, now space flight, the automobile industry. Obviously, you have a wider knowledge of these events than I do. I know we're not done with these, but and we discussed already, things becoming routine. But is this something that, with the sheer, the volume of rocket fuel, the amount of danger in those explosions, that's what we're ultimately talking about. Is that something that can ever be, safe is the wrong word, but you mentioned earlier, when you're in an airplane and you don't think about all the things going on around you, you're drinking your orange juice, you're not in airplane mode on your iPhone, even though you should be, per the law. Do we see men and women 100 years from now, 200 years from now, drinking their orange juice and taking off from, the ISS to go to the moon or wherever, out into space for we're going to fly around for a while. We're going to take a drive. Does it ever become that, not just commonplace, but the level of comfort? Is that ever there?
Yeah, that's a great question, Daniel. I have multiple answers. A, yes, right. I think it will happen. B, I personally have a hard time imagining it because it's probably so far beyond my lifetime and our lifetimes to get to that level of routine. There's a famous scene in the movie 2001, the late 1960s Stanley Kubrick film 2001, mm-hmm. where the government guy is taking a Pan Am flight to the moon, and he's just sitting there drinking his whatever whiskey or whatever he was drinking, and it's just right. This flight attendant comes over and gives him a meal, and it's like it's just like okay, it's like being on a plane. I just happen to be going to the moon, whatever. We're a long way from that. That's a wonderfully imagined future, but it's also right now kind of science fiction, right? We're a long way away from that. But we are on a trajectory as a society, as a civilization, for that to be realized. And there are these parallels from the past that provide the models to do it. It's just going to take time.
Awesome. Well, Jim, thanks so much for spending this time with me, having this conversation. I feel much better informed. Hopefully you had a good time.
I did. That was great questions and fun things to think about and be optimistic about for our future. Thanks for having me on the show.
Absolutely. Thank you very much. And thanks to everyone at home for joining us. I hope today's conversation was as enlightening for you as it was for me. Please come back next week when I will be discussing more of the history we live through every day.